Hello, guys, and welcome back to Joe's Ventures. And today we're going to be doing another episode of our Planet Zoo mod spotlight. So this will be part 144. So we take a look at some of the wonderful mods people have been making and use them to talk about some of the wonderful biodiversity that we share our world with. So today we've got quite an interesting assortment. This is actually a whole pack of exhibit animals that I'm going to go through today in this episode. So a little bit different from the usual. So this is the dart frog, poison dart frog, and tree frog pack, or just the frog pack, you could just call it simply. That introduces about 12, or technically about 12 new species of frog, but there's a couple morphs in there as well. So this mod was done by Narwhal, Scott, and Hexabit, so really excited to get stuck into this one. So I'm not going to go to, because they're all made by the same people. They all were part of this, so I'm going to leave it there. So all these mods were done by Narwhal, Scott, and Hexabit. So first up, we're going to be having a look at this really cool species here. We've got the dying poison dart frog. So let's have a look at them in the exhibit camera. Really cute. So let's see. We've got a couple morphs that we'll get into. So let me just find a nice picture of a normal one. So this is a dying dart frog, or a Dendrobates trignurix, also known as cobalt poison frog or dying poison frog, or as a nickname they've given in the hobby, Tinks. So these guys are a really cool frog. So they're really famous in the dark frog keeping hobby as being the most variable colored and the largest of all the types of frogs, poison dart frogs, which is really interesting. So we'll get into them. So the specific name refers to basically use these frogs to cause green palette colors to grow different colors as well. But in terms of habitat, these guys exist in like discrete patches of Guiana Shield from about up to about 600 meters or 2,000 feet. And they're typically found in regions within tropical primary forests, but also associated with gaps in the canopy. They can be found at sea level. They're mostly found in more upland areas, and the isolated populations is seen by the erosion and seasonal induction of these interpatch areas. So they can be quite fragmented because of the erosion and things like that. And there's actually a study looking into the tadpoles that they say the tadpoles actually like pools of high levels of carbonate hardness, which is quite interesting. At vertical height up to 15 meters or 49 feet, and salinity up to 955 parts per million, which is pretty interesting. So they are very large. They're actually the largest of all the dart frogs. They're pretty large, but they may be smaller than a couple other species. Typically, they reach about 3.5 centimeters or 1.4 inches from snout to vent, and most variants are about 5 centimeters or slightly bigger. And the largest variants or the largest morphs can get about 7 centimeters, so quite huge. And although some variants are smaller and larger, differences can be seen in the overall lap of size and the full range, as a large individual or small individual is comparable to the size of small individual, so it's quite interesting. Typically, males are a little bit shorter than, or smaller and more slender than females, but have larger toe discs. And the toe discs of females are circular while the males are heart-shaped, and they have an arched back as opposed to curved ones. So what makes this guy really interesting is morphs. So they're actually one of the most variable colors of all the different types of dart frogs, and there's actually about 30 recognized variants or morphs. So a lot of people think, oh, they're different species, but they seem to be morphs since they all can breed quite readily. So each variety or morph is unique to a locale or region. There's to have a visual variation within each morph. So typically, this is, we'll go back. This is the more typical color, as you can kind of see. The more typical color, primarily black with a yellowish and whitish stripes. Also got some dark on them as well, and a bit of blue on the bottom. But this is a really cool morph. Oh, we'll go back because that was in a good light. So this is a morph called the Azorus morph, which is basically like blue with black spots all over it, kind of what you think of a dart frogs. This is the Azorus. So this is found in the southern Suriname, which is considered now a variety of these frogs, but it's now as a morph. It was, I believe, considered its own species, and now it's considered a morph. But despite all the different variation, all these different morphs, all the 30 different morphs that you can get, and all sorts of variety of different colors and things like that, they are all considered the same species, as there's not much genetic difference. It's just potentially different ways to tell. But dangerous, don't mess with me. And plus individual variation. It seems to be in dart frogs, colors can be very plastic, which is really interesting. So very similar to most other types of dart frogs as well. These guys have poisons, or which they can get. So they typically get their poisons from what they eat, typically like ants and things like that. And they have puma toxins and puma toxins that are used for self-defense. So usually they are toxic to most animals if they eat them or try to like lick them or touch them. So you got to be very, very careful. And they can include things including death, but people are able to keep them because they don't get fed these kind of things in captivity, so they can pretty much be poisonless in captivity and be fine. And there's been lots of reports of them killing people in numbness and things like that. But yeah, and the main alkaloid is plumotoxin, which is highly toxic. So this toxin actually interferes with the contraction of muscles, of the calcium channels within it, and can cause issues with locomotion, chronic convulsions, paralysis, and even death. And even sometimes like respiratory problems, because the sodium and potassium channels impact the muscle contraction, and which impacts your heart and breathing. So that's kind of the way that you die. But yeah, really, really cool. And we got a couple morphs on this one as well. Really interesting species. So next up we have got the green and black poison frog, another really, really cool frog. So very similar. So these guys are also known as, oh, look at the first one on Good Go. So let's see if we can find the morph as well. There's a morph. Is there a good morph in the good light? Let's see if we can find the morph in the light. Look at you. We won't worry about the morphs just yet. So the green and black poison dart frog, or Dendrobates acturus, or the green and black poison dart frog, they're a brightly coloured frog from Central America and Colombia. And they've also been introduced in Hawaii to reduce mosquito numbers, which is quite interesting. They're also the next most variable species of poison dart frog after the dying dart frog, which is quite interesting. So these guys are typical appearances, like snout to vent length is about 0.5 or 1.9 centimeters snout to vent length, and females get about 2.5 centimeters or an inch in length. They're one of the most variable in color, as they have all sorts of different morphs and things like that. This variation can be seen in some exact locations, but there's kind of a really common highland morph that you can find. It's kind of like a really, really light color, like these ones that we saw before. No, not this one. This one, so like a really, really light one. But there's all sorts of different morphs and things as well. They can get like turquoise, blue, whitish yellow, and all sorts of different patterns and colors with all the different morphs you can get with these guys, which is really interesting. So in terms of their distribution, they're found around southern Nicaragua and the Atlantic slope, and Costa Rica, Panama, into Colombia, as northwestern Colombia. As I mentioned, they've also been introduced to Malawi and Oahu on Hawaii to control populations. But being a dart frog, they are toxic, but they lose it in captivity due to us changing their diets. So they believe that their diet, they collect the poisons from the mites and ants that they eat, which is pretty interesting. So in terms of their behavior, like other dart frogs, they're semi-arboreal, so they hunt, court, and sleep in trees. And like other dart frogs, they spend a bit much of their time in shallow pools of water created by bromeliad leaves, which have a cup that hold water. And these plants actually really also act as a little nursery for tadpoles. And as a tiny frog, they can't leap from branch to branch, but they return to the ground when it wants to travel. And they may travel up to several miles in an effort to breed, thus feeding grounds or taking care of tadpoles. And to assist in climbing, they have small sucker-like discs that allow them to stick to trees. So in terms of reproduction, very similar to, which is actually unlike other poison dart frogs, they actually gather in large groups to mate. They'll squabble over territories, and then eventually each individual male will clear a patch for himself, and the females will wander the males, and then they'll obviously, and then you try and repress her with a bird-like mating calls. Then once he leads her to a site that he has selected for egg deposition, and the female will lay the eggs in that site, and the male then fertilize them. In about 14 days, these little babies will hatch into tadpoles, and then the parents, typically the male, but the female can sometimes too, will carry the tadpoles into the canopy with tadpoles sticking to the mucus on the back of the parent, and they deposit them in these small bromeliad pools that allow them to kind of like, and they'll be feeding on algae and small invertebrates that live in these pools as well. So yeah, that's quite cool, and they're also quite common in the keeping hobby or the poison dart frog hobby, since a lot of people like to keep them. They are popular exotic pets because of their small size and behavior, and being amphibians, you shouldn't really hold them too much because they have very permeable skin. So yeah, this is another common thing with those guys. So next up, we got our third guy. This is the blessed poison dart frog. Really, really cute little guy. So this is Rhatomeda bendicata, I believe you say that. So this one doesn't have a morph, so we'll just look at this guy. So these guys are a species of poison dart frog found in the lowland rainforest of the Pampas de Sacramento, in southern Orento and eastern San Martin region in northern Peru. And before 2008, it was actually considered a subspecies of a close species, Fantastica, but now is considered vulnerable, which is a little bit sad. So the reason they're considered vulnerable is because of limited habitat range, habitat loss, and collection for the pet trade. So the pet trade is both a blessing and a curse in that regard. These guys are actually one of the bigger species of what's called the thumbnail poison dart frogs, and you can see they've got a red head and a large and a snout to vent with that helps distinguish us from other species. So they are a little bit bigger than most other species of thumbnail poison dart frogs. They get about 16.5 millimeters from snout to vent, while larger females can get about 18.4 millimeters, some even reaching 20.2 millimeters from snout to vent. And besides the red heads, you can also see they've got this dark marking and also like this W-shaped mask as well, with also dark coloured limbs and things like that. A little bit of variation. And in some populations, they have a reticulated pattern that might actually not appear, and they'll sometimes appear like a uniform blue. So there's a lot of variation there as well. And while Rhabdomera fantastica may resemble the species, it's got a blue head, while this guy's got a red head. So that's kind of the easiest way to tell them apart. But yeah, really, really cool. Love these guys. So next up, we're going to be moving on to our next species. This is the strawberry poison dart frog, another really popular one. So the strawberry poison dart frog, also called the blue jeans dart frog. So we're originally in the same genus as these last few species, the Dendrobates, but these guys are now called Euophaga, which is quite interesting. So these guys are quite a common, well-known species of dart frog. Let's see if we can find one hanging out in the... And there we are in the light. Look at this little guy, a little friend. Anyway, so there are small species of dart frog found and extends from kind of Nicaragua through Costa Rica into Panama. They're often found in humid, lowland, and pre-montane forests, but large populations have been found in plantations is cool. And they're actually one of the most famous for its widespread variation and has up between 15 to 30 color morphs, which are presumed to be true breeding, which is interesting. And they're actually one of the most poisonous of all the poisonous dart frogs. So this guy has a pretty special place. So the diet of these guys allows them to become toxic. So these guys, certain subspecies of mites and ants ingest are very similar to many other dart frogs. So these guys have the same sort of toxins as I mentioned before that can cause paralysis and death and things like that. As I say, casually. But it's actually been found is once they reach sexual maturity, their diets will shift and they become more toxic. And it's common to find 53% more alkaloids than adult males. So kind of the bigger ones will be females are more common to find more poisonous. The males are a little bit more, a little bit not as quite as poisonous. And they seem to get this from digesting arthropods and things like that, which is quite interesting. In terms of behavior, these guys are diurnal and primarily terrestrial and can be found on the leaf litter of both forested and disturbed areas. So these guys are a little bit more land-lubbing than the other tree dart frogs, you could say. So these guys, also the males will spend more energy defending smaller but high-quality areas, and there's evidence to suggest that these guys have competitors, and like males will guard smaller sites with higher female density. And as with most endurance, they use these vocalizations to kind of compete. However, these guys call at a lower rate to limit energy use. And they're quite toxic and brightly coloured, but also relatively small. They get between 17.5 and 22 millimeters, or about 0.69 to 0.87 inches in length. So one of the smaller frogs, but still cool. They are considered least concern, as I mentioned. So in terms of Euophaga palomino is an external breeder, and they actually show quite a high degree of parental care, and we'll talk about why they get their name from. They'll have due parental care. So what happens, the male will defend the water and nest, and the female will feed the tadpoles in the pond unfertilized eggs, where they get the name Euophaga. So the female will feed them with unfertilized eggs, and the male kind of protects them. And although both in males and females contribute to parental care, females invest much more heavily as they give energy. They have to make the eggs to feed them, and they lose potential reproduction. When choosing a partner for mating, the females actually choose the closest calling male rather than the highest quality male, so females are lazy. Females also provide energetically cost for the tadpoles about 6 to 8 weeks until they metamorphosize, and remaining sexually inactive during tadpole rearing, so they can only have a clutch of about 4 to 6 tadpoles at a time. The males contribute via relatively cheap acting of watering and protecting the eggs for a relatively short period of time, about 10 to 12 days, but they walk off and do their own thing. And this extreme investment in their babies of laying the eggs, they do have a high egg mortality. So only about 5% or 12% of the clutch will develop into tadpoles. So the female actually makes the best increase, like making sure those few eggs grow into tadpoles. So most of the eggs they lay won't actually hatch. They'll be just gone to feed the tadpoles that they have, which is quite interesting. So after mating, the female actually will lay 3 to 5 eggs on a leaf or bromeliad pole. And the male will keep them hydrated by transporting water in his cloaca. And after about 10 days, the eggs will hatch, and the tadpoles will be taken on her back to a waterfall location. And in captivity, they've actually been observed to hitch a ride, even though it's unknown. And bromeliads seem to be frequently used for tadpole disposition sites, but anything suitable can be used, like small puddles, even like trash cans and aluminum cans and things like that can be used. In tadpoles, they deposit singly in location, and the female will come back each few days and deposit eggs for them to feed on. And in captivity, they have been raised in many diets, such as algae from the eggs of other dart frogs, which is very interesting as well. And after about a month, they'll turn into a small froglet and then stay near their water source for a few days while they exhaust their tail and then run off and do their thing. So, as I mentioned, these guys very much, they seem to be in lots of different patterns. There's been isolated for more than 10,000 years, probably during the Ice Age. So, there's lots of different genetic drift going on, and lots of different patterns and things like that have changed, which is really interesting as well. And in terms of the habitat niche, these guys actually use scattered structures and distributed lands and things like that. However, these guys still like warmer. They prefer temperatures up to about 27 degrees Celsius. And these finding stage other species can act as a buffer and would be more successful when land use or temperature rises. So these guys might actually do a little bit better with climate change, which is a little bit of a good thing. Not really a good thing, because that means other species won't do so well, but they will be able to adapt to people and things like that. And they are popular in captivity because they're striking colours in their life cycle. They're quite common in the United States. There were vast quantities imported in the early 1990s. We get them for $75. Now they're pretty much just bred, much more diverse due to smuggling and things like that. But they seem to still be some smuggling, but they try to stop them pretty much. Hobbyists try to use captive raised individuals because it's much easier to find them, also much easier for them to adapt to captivity. So if you're going to get frogs or any kind of exotic pet, make sure it's captive bred, unless you're an experienced breeder trying to introduce new genetic lines, because usually it's just so much easier to deal with babies that are captive born rather than wild caught. So even though it may be a little bit more expensive, it is better in the long run. So you're getting a better quality product. And the most common species or morph you could say you get in the pet trade is these kind of blue jeans morph. So you can see it's got blue jeans. But yeah, it's really, really cool. Definitely a big fan. That's the strawberry dart frog. So what have we got next? Next up, we've got the Gulf Decian poison frog, poison dart frog. So let's have a look at these guys. That's a really interesting one. So this is a camera. Ooh, perfect again. So these guys are a species of frog that are endemic to Costa Rica. So these guys are actually quite a large frog. They reach about 3.5 centimeters in adulthood, with females typically being larger than males. They're typically more smooth-bodied than other species in the genus, have almost perfect sloping backs. But unlike their relatives, they do not have visible shoulder blades, and that gives them also the appearance of being overweight. And they often are black, but they may actually glitter due to the chemical pigments in their skin, and they do have some little mottled patterns of blue or green, or sometimes even orange as well. And these stripes can be usually fire orange, but they may be golden yellow or green, and extend to the cloaca pretty much. So in terms of its relatives, these guys, like other members, they do have that orcholoid toxin that they get from that. I don't really need to go over that again. But these guys seem to have got them from a small beetle. That's where they typically get theirs from. And actually, the fourth most toxic in the genus are phyllobates, which is quite interesting. So there's lots of difference of toxins as well. Then they're compared to the large size of the frog, they can store a lot of blood poison as well. So that's part of the reason why they're so toxic. So in terms of the habitats, they are found in lowland, moist and wet forests between 20 to 550 meters above sea level, or about 60 to 1800 feet. They are diurnal and terrestrial, and eggs are usually laid in leaves above the ground. The hatching tadpoles are typically transported by males, very similar to other dart frogs species. And they're considered vulnerable, so as I mentioned, there's also the climate change, collection, habitat destruction, things like that. Most things that affect other frogs. And these guys are also communal animals, so they readily become available in the pet trade. So you can keep them in vivariums about 100 by 60 by 60, and that gives enough space to climb and move around. And they can be held together, though there's issue, of course, with fungi and things like that. And they're not poisonous in captivity because we don't feed them the animals that give them their poison. But yeah, really, really cool. Definitely a little fan of this guy. So that's the Gulfildian dart frog. Next up, we have got the Pasco poison dart frog. So let's have a look at this guy, little friend. Let's see if you can find one that's sitting. There we are, perfect little guy. He's posing for us. I love these little guys. So this is the Pasco, also known as the Sierra poison dart frog. So these are found in the Amazon rainforest of northern Bolivia, westernmost Brazil, and eastern Peru. So, as I mentioned, they're actually a mildly toxic species. So they secrete smaller amounts that can cause pain and muscle spasms if they're not handled correctly, but they're not nearly as toxic as the other species we've mentioned, which is quite good. And as I mentioned, they also lose their poison captivity because we don't feed them the exits that give them their poison. Uh, and in terms of their habitat and conservation, these guys are species that like pre-montane, montane, and lowland, moist secondary tropical forests. And they can tolerate some degree of habitat modification, which is good. And they are typically collected for the illegal pet trade, which is a threat to particular populations that have really interesting color morphs. So that can be a big thing for really isolated populations. So making sure that they're not over collected. And luckily, they are still considered least concern though, so they're still doing quite well across their range, which is really cool. They are kept as pets, as I mentioned, as the Sierra black frog, poison frog, as herpiculturalists, and actually one of the most difficult to keep because they're their relatively rare nature, but also their tadpoles tend to be really, really delicate for whatever reason. So you got to make sure that you treat them right. You got to be very careful with that. So they're kind of like in the dart frog, keeping trade. These guys are kind of like really hard to keep and really hard to get captive bred. So yeah, but still really, really cool though. Really, really awesome. So that's the Pasco poison dart frog, also known as Sierra poison dart frog, found in eastern Peru, western Brazil, and Bolivia. So quite a wide range. So next up, this is our second to last. We've got the phantasmal poison dart frog, which is really cool. So let's have a look at these guys. Boop, 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 boop. Here we are. Look at the posing right there for me. Thank you very much. So the phantasmal poison dart frog, also known as the phantasmal poison arrow frog, these guys are a species of dart frog that are endemic to Ecuador. So they're found along the Andean slopes of central Ecuador and the Bolivar province. They are sadly also endangered, and they're only known from a few locations in the wild, and they have those quite radiant colors. So in terms of their distribution, so these guys have a snout to vent length of about 22.6 millimeters, or just under an inch, and you can see they've got wide head and tubercated snout. Also, their first finger is longer than their second, which is quite interesting. And all their digits are partly webbed. And you can see they're kind of covered in these long stripes that are like green or yellow, which is really interesting, and all the red as well. So in terms of their habitat, these guys are only found in a number of locations in central Ecuador on the Andean slopes, between about 319 to 1,769 meters, or between 1,000 to 5,800 feet above sea level. And their natural habitat is very similar to other dart frogs. They like to live in a leaf litter or on the floor of tropical forests near wetlands and streams, which is pretty cool. So these species inhabit the Chacoan tropical and subtropical rainforests. Habitats include denatured forested areas as well as natural forests, and they've been found in plantations of like banana and cacao ones as well. And they may carry tadpoles. The males will carry the tadpoles in sites with running water, and they also secrete a substance called, or a chemical called erbethaline, which is actually has great interest for pharmaceuticals, which is interesting. They live in a very similar areas to the species Epidendrus manchella, and yet the two occupy different niches, so they're able to cannot compete with each other. And they seem to have diverted about recently by splitting. And sadly, these guys are considered a vulnerable species by the IUCN. They have a quite limited range, so their range is considered less than 5,000 square kilometers. And there has been an apparent decline in the species, that's not that common in the pet trade. But yeah, so these guys are sadly really threatened by habitat destruction. But yeah, really cool little guys. I cannot love these little frogs. And our last dart frog for today, we're going to have a look at the yellow banded dart frog, another really, really cool little guy. We do love these little guys. So you can find one in a... There we are, we'll look at you standing on there. Really, really cool. So the yellow banded poison dart frog, also known as the yellow-headed poison dart frog, or the bumblebee poison frog. These guys are another species in the genus Tetrabates, so very much like the dying and black and green frogs before, in the same similar genus. So these guys are a common dart frog found in the northern part of the continent of South America, usually Venezuela, but can be found in Brazil, Guyana, and extreme easternmost points of Colombia. So this amphibian is typically, like other species, found in humid tropical rainforests, close to freshwater, and like even plants like bromeliads, very similar to like that. They are tropical, and not subject to great seasonal variations, but they prefer habitats between like 26 to 30 degrees or in captivity. You got to be very careful with in captivity having them in higher temperatures, but they tend to like those temperatures. And although they prefer high humidity levels, they cannot handle lower humidity than much better than other species in the genus, so they need to pretty much be quite humid. They're also quite big. They are considered one of the largest species in that genus, so they get between 3.1 to 5 centimeters or 1.2 to 2 inches long. So very comparable in size to the dying and black and green poison dart frogs. Adult average size, however, is really exceeds about 4 centimeters or about 1.6 inches, and the average weight is about 3 grams. So females tend to be slightly larger than males, but otherwise little has changed in their appearance. And much like other species of poison dart frogs, they have these bright colors to scare away predators as they, hey, I'm poisonous, don't mess with me. And this makes them a bad meal. And they do have a little bit of variation within that, but various numbers of stripes and things like that. There's all sorts of different morphs as well that have been naturally occurring and not morphs made within the pet trade. So lots of naturally occurring morphs and variations very similar to other species. And like other types, they do have toes that allow them to little like pads that allow them to hitch to things like bamboo and glass and things like that. That allows them to climb. So they are diurnal by nature and quite territorial, and they live in small groups, and they've been known to estivate during really dry seasons as well. And very much like other species, they are quite toxic, so they eat little invertebrates like the local variation of the murrelet beetle that gives them their neurotoxins. And it varies from species to species. These guys are kind of in the middle, we talk about. And they're relatively common in the wild. They are considered least concern, so they're doing quite common. They have a wide range. They're quite robust. They're able to adapt to a lot of different habitats, so they are considered doing pretty well. They are considered least concern. However, there is concerns of over harvesting for the exotic pet trade, but also habitat destruction, things like that is an issue. But these guys luckily are easily bred in captivity, so there's been a fall of prices in the market, which is really helping to protect their wild populations. So they're doing mostly okay in that regard, which is really, really cool. So that's all the dart frogs for today. Now we're going to be moving on to the last 4 species of the pack. We have got tree frogs. So we're going to be starting off with the tiger striped frog, tree frog. So let's have a look at this guy. Look at this skinny little friend here. So, he's moving. He's schmoving. We'll have a look at you. I love you. Just such in a funky position. We'll have to talk about you. So, this is called Calamedusa tropoptenera, I believe you say that. So these are tiger-striped tree frog from the family Phyllomyzidae. And they are found in northern parts of South America, so the upper Amazon basin, Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia, also Brazil and the Guianas and French Guiana, and actually might represent more than one species, which is quite interesting. So these guys are considered an arboreal species that like to live in pristine tropical rainforests, usually on trees or around semi-temporary or temporary pools in the wet season. But they've been found in open areas and flooded forest edges and things like that. They occur up to about 500 meters or 600 feet above sea level, and they're an uncommon species in most part of their range and do suffer locally from habitat loss. Typically, their appearance, these guys measure about 44 millimeters or about 1.7 inches, or 54 millimeters or 2.1 inches at snout to vent length. An average female frog is about 60 millimeters or 2.4 inches. And they get their name, the tiger, because of their tiger stripes along their flanks there, the orange there. And the iris, as you can see, like a silverish grey, which is quite interesting as well. So these guys are nocturnal and sleep throughout the day, but during the nighttime, the males will communicate with vocal calls, and then during the nighttime, they'll search for food. The reproduction of the species is marked by the uniqueness of egg deposition, so they typically lay them on green leaves hanging over standing water, where the tadpoles are complete development. And the lack of availability of sites for reproduction can lead to them being shared by other species and can lead to interspecific mating. So sometimes they do hybridize with other species of tree frogs or leaf frogs, things like that. So there's been shown of that. In terms of their threats, some things like clutch predation. So lots of other species can be attacked by predators such as phollid flies and other predators. And adult predation, these guys are quite commonly preyed on by snakes, like cat-eyed snakes, that can actually deal with the toxins and actually eat these guys. So yeah, really, really cool guy there. So that's the tiger striped tree frog. Next up, we have got the clown tree frog, or the Ceves sacabro tree frog, or Dendrophosphus sacariensis, if you would say that. So it's kind of a clown one. Not too dissimilar, of course. Still really, really cute, though. So these guys are considered, they're typically found, they're family Hyalidae, so it's a different species of frogs, tree frogs. They can be found in Amazon basin in Bolivia, Brazil, Ecuador, Peru, Venezuela, and Colombia. They share a part of their range in nocturnal, so Peru and Ecuador, they're nocturnal, and quite common in the parts of its range. And they are arboreal, so they inhabit understory vegetation and primary and secondary tropical rainforests. And typically, like the other species I mentioned, like the tiger stripe, these guys are typically laid out of the water. The eggs are laid out of the water, and the tadpoles develop in the water in temporary or permanent pools, which is quite interesting. So yeah, we'll actually have a little bit more of a look at you guys and see all the different. So these guys are really really cool. Really interesting pattern. Really do love these guys. Definitely such awesome little froggies. Really really cool. So next up, we have got the blue-sided leaf frog coming up. So this is the kind of the one that you often think about, uh, very similar to like the red one. So this is kind of one of the common, really funny frogs you see. So here we got one here, little friend. So these guys are also known as the orange-eyed leaf frog. They're an endangered species, which is a little bit sad. So they're native to the tropical rainforests of Costa Rica and Panama. And their specific name, NRA, actually honors Anne Sir Dumbleman, who actually is the collector of the holotype and the wife of the person who described it. So that's quite cool as well. So these guys have quite a restricted range. These guys are only known from the central valley of Costa Rica on the slopes of the Corralo de Talamalaca and the Corralo de Turan and the Corredalo Central Ranges between 600 to 1,650 meters, or between 2,000 to 5,400 feet. And the total range is estimated to be about 16,000 kilometers. And there may be a subpopulation in western Panama where a single female has been found, but we don't really know. And much of the forest that they said had lived in been cleared. So a number of subpopulations have been separated by plantations, urban areas, and obviously cultivated areas as well. So in terms of status, this means they're endangered. So they're fairly common in parts of the Central Valley and the undisturbed forests. They've disappeared from pristine areas in 1980. And although they've been living in some populations, they seem to be doing well, but they tend to be fragmented and by urban development. And local extinctions have been suggested to be by climate change, but also the introduced chytrid fungus, which has decimated a lot of frog populations across South America. And some individuals have tested positive for the fungus, but yes, their species persist in the localities, and they're considered a vulnerable species or particularly endangered because of that, which is a little bit sad, but still really, really cool species. So then now we've got, last but not least, we have got the Brummerstetter leaf frog. So let's have a look at these guys. Very interesting colors on these guys. I think you can definitely see that. So they're also known as the common walking leaf frog, or the Brummerstetter tree frog, or it's called Philomedusa brummerstedti, I believe you say that. So they do show sexual dimorphism. So males in mean are about 63 to 4.5 millimeters, or 76. So the females are a little bit larger. In terms of calls, they use calls to communicate, and they use calls that can be really short and long calls. They have a variety of calls that they use to display and threaten each other. They use pulse calls to scare each other or warn of predators, which things like that, which is quite interesting. So there are two branches of this kind of species. There's one found in the Rio de Janeiro in South America, and the population is found around Brazil and places like that. So there is two different kind of like genetic ones, but they're still the same species. In terms of behavior, they communicate through visual behaviors. So they use a calling sight, and they utilize tree branches high up in the air with very few leaves and vegetation. And one theory is that they actually make these calls in the high barren branches to allow it to get a clear visual field of communicating with the frogs. So we don't know why they exactly do that, but that's one of their things as well. They also are very heavily reliant on visual communication, so that's potentially why they may have done that. So they communicate not only through sound, but also through displaying. So let's see if we can find another one that's kind of quite bright. There we are. Look at you, little friend. Little goober. Anyway, so in terms of mating, visual communication is used a lot when mating. The males will slowly stretch and unstretch their patterned legs as part of the mating display, and it can be described as like a pedaling movement. And the males increase their call rate, which is in pulses per call, in response to this leg stressing that allows the female to easily be able to find them. And then they will basically mate, and then they leave a leaf in the clutter, and the male will incubate them. So in terms of tadpoles, they have tadpoles that are about 4.6.8 millimeters long, so about 4 centimeters. They also have a narrow body with a trapezoid shape, and the width of their body is about 1/3 their body length. They're usually considered a dull green color, but also have dorsal stripes. They're also active during both the day and night, and use small stationary pools for the majority of the time. However, when they are startled, they will flee to deeper parts or hide in any rocks and things they can find. In terms of parental care, so egg capsules will surround them on all sides, and the female will usually remain with her eggs to protect them, and the male frog will leave. So the female is a good mother, not so good dad, but anyway. So the eggless capsules leave the surround of the eggs to prevent the desiccation and drying of the eggs, and the eggs need moisture as they develop. But luckily, the environment's typically humid enough for them to stay nice and lubricated as they grow. In terms of their hunting strategies, they've been known to use pedal luring. So pedal luring is actually used by many frog species. So they start out by latching onto something and waiting for prey to come by. And once it's prey, they'll actually face towards the insect and start to move their 4th to 5th toe and like to pedal in a manner to kind of get their attention. And then once they get their attention, they try to come attack. They'll attack the luring them in and then attack them, which is quite interesting with their tongue. So that's quite cool. In terms of diet, these guys mainly eat on ornithopterans, cockroaches, spiders, and crickets. So they eat on all sorts of smaller vertebrates. And since most of them live on the ground, they do most of their feeding or hunting on the ground or on the rainforest floor. In terms of conservation, they are doing okay. They are considered least concern, but very other things that affect a lot of other frog species is deforestation, since they rely on that humid environment. But also, they seem to be somewhat resilient and able to adapt to new environments, so they're not doing too bad. But a lot of other species are, of course, not as good as developing to these habitats as they are. So they seem to be doing okay. And they actually do have some contributed a bit towards science. So insulin is the hormone, if you've got diabetes, it can't get rid of sugars and things like that. But actually, they actually use the peptide of psilocybin PBU actually to help catalyze insulin. So it's actually really important with that as well. And they actually use them for antimicrobial, antifungal, and antibacterial kind of properties. So these guys have been studied a lot of stuff to help things like that, to help human health. So that's quite cool, creating new therapies. So really, really cool. So I think that's it for today. So as I mentioned, this wonderful frog pack, with the tree frogs and the poison dart frogs, were all done by Narwhal, Narwhal, Scott, and Hexabit. All did a wonderful job, and I love talking about all these frogs. Really, really cool. So yeah, I think this is a great place to end the video. So I really, really, really hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hope you guys like and subscribe. Always remember to hit the little bell icon to get notified of anything. So yeah, if you guys enjoyed this video, hope you guys like and subscribe, and bye-bye.